Now, we've got a bit of a story with James, and the Sydney University students know the story, but the locals don't. So James's professor, Stephen Cuddle, contacted us a few years ago and said, I've got this young undergrad, and he's actually interested in rangelands. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, he wants to do some work out here. He's a soil scientist. And I said, fantastic, bring him out. So I don't think James realised that we're 8 hours from Sydney, but he came out, he did his undergraduate thesis out here, and he's now progressing, and he's about soon about to submit his PhD thesis, and which I'm going to be a little bit proud about that, James. We've helped you on the journey, and it's just wonderful to have that work done and completed in this area and published. And we'd like more students, I'm looking at you, to come out here and work with us, and we do our best to support you the best we can. So we were out in the paddock with James yesterday. We had a great day out there. He's digging soil. He loves digging soil, and he's even brought some soil. We've got soil here, and he's going to be talking about his PhD. He's about to submit, and it's a really good story. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Sally. Appreciate being invited back to Hay once again. It's great to have opportunities to come out and talk to my research to people who might actually have an end use for it, rather than it just going into a publication where 3 or 4 people might end up reading it at some point. And thank you so much for all your help over the years with my thesis. I couldn't have done it without your assistance, helping me find sites and helping me out in the Hay community. So it's been excellent. So today I will be talking about soil organic carbon sequestration in the Hay Plains. And the Hay Plains is an interesting area to study soil carbon because it's a rangeland environment, and carbon sequestration in the rangelands is quite a tricky topic because rangeland environments are characterised by low rainfall naturally, and that means we have relatively low net primary productivity, so low photosynthesis happening within the landscape, and therefore we've got low carbon accumulation within this environment. And so that makes it a challenging place to undergo carbon sequestration, but there is still a lot of interest in the rangelands for carbon sequestration opportunities because of the large area that's being managed by landholders in these areas. And so the idea is that even though we've got relatively low quantities of soil carbon in this environment, if we can change that amount even a little bit across a very large area, we can have quite a substantial amount of carbon being sequestered in this landscape. And I'll be talking about 2 case studies that I've done during my PhD, which highlight some of the challenges with managing carbon in these environments, and also challenges the idea that we can make small changes across big areas to sequester carbon, because it is a bit trickier than that, particularly with detecting those changes. And so the first case study that I'll be talking about is reclaiming scalded soils using a technique called water ponding. And so I'll kick into that. And so what is a scald to start off with? I'm sure anyone from around the Hay region is familiar with this landscape feature. So scalds are bare areas of soil. They're sometimes called clay pans that have a crusted soil surface. And so these features form when very severe wind erosion events remove all of the topsoil off a saline sodic clay subsoil layer, exposing it to the surface. And because of the high concentration of sodium salts in these subsoils, we end up getting a crusted surface across the surface of the soil. And the problem we have here is this crust prevents water infiltrating into the soil profile, and so we end up with this fine crust on the surface and an almost perfectly dry salty soil profile underneath. And these features will shed water with even as little slope as 0.5 degree. So in this flat landscape, even small undulations will prevent these features being able to accumulate water. And basically, as soon as any water gets on that crusted surface, we're losing it to run off to somewhere else within the landscape. And so this is a real issue because we end up with these large areas. There can be tens of hectares on properties that are scalded, which are completely unproductive. And this isn't supporting any net primary productivity. There's no plants, we've got no pasture, and therefore we've got a very low carbon environment because we have no carbon inputs coming from plants into this soil. And so this is a very prevalent issue, particularly in the first half of last century. There was quite severe erosion throughout the rangelands in New South Wales. And that got the Soil Conservation Service back in the late 50s and early 60s to start a large program looking at how we can remediate these scalded features within the landscape. And they trialled a variety of things that landholders have been doing, and in the Hay Plains region specifically, they had 6 experimental areas where they trialled a bunch of these techniques that landholders have been using to try and figure out which ones were most effective. And here's a little map of one of the sites that I sampled that was done by the Soil Conservation Service, found by Sally, thank you. This was invaluable to me. And it shows a bunch of the different treatments. They tried all sorts of stuff. They were putting bitumen on the soil surface, catch-all oil, but the techniques that they found to be most effective are these little lines down here. These are called ponding banks, and basically they just drive a road grader along and they create a little bank facing downhill that traps water. And they found these to be very effective at remediating these scalds because these banks trap enough water on the scald surface long enough that it can slowly seep through that crust, and then it can start mobilising those salts further down the soil profile. And so this is a photo from a sampling site near Brewarrina in the north of the state, and you can see that across a very large area of this property that water ponds have been put out, and so this has been a fairly widely adopted technique throughout New South Wales, particularly up in the Marra region near Brewarrina. There's some really extensive water pondings going on up there. And you can see it's been mostly effective at reclaiming a lot of that scalded area. And we have pasture returning to these areas, we have net primary productivity, and therefore we should have carbon sequestration occurring. And so I'll quickly talk through a little bit of what's going on when water ponds are put in. So you can see I've got 2 soil profiles here. These are from a property near Hay. We have this crusted surface near the top of the scald, which is what's impeding water entering the soil. And then when we create one of those water ponds, that water can slowly seep through the surface and it can start mobilising salts. And what we have go on is we actually have a structural decline in the soil. Because in our scalded soil profile, you can see there, we've actually got a really beautifully structured vertisol with very fine peds. So to people who are enthusiasts of soil, it feels almost like a crime to be undoing this beautiful structure, but it's necessary for the recovery of the soil. And so when we wash the salts out of this soil profile, the salts, which are actually helping aggregate those small peds, get washed further down the soil profile, down to about 50 centimetres where a new wetting front forms, and then we have larger peds form near the surface of the soil. And that's important because those larger peds, when we have the shrink swell action of this vertic soil, we get large cracks form between those peds, and that basically just creates cracks at the surface which break up the surface of that crust. So we're not actually fixing the crust, we're just breaking it up with large cracks, which allows more water to infiltrate into the soil profile. And then we have a reinforcing system where more water's getting in, more salts are being leached, and then plants can re-establish in this area. And this is just a little bit of soil chemistry here. So on the your far left-hand side, we've got the electrical conductivity. That yellow line might be a little bit hard to see, but that's indicating quite high salts near the surface because electrical conductivity is a measurement of salt. And then across from that, just to its the right, we've got an Aswat score, which is a measurement of aggregate stability in soils. And we can see that the yellow line is decreasing as the salts increase, and that's just showing that this soil is being aggregated by those salts. And then our green line is the reclaimed soil, and we can see that those salts have been flushed down to 50 centimetres in that soil profile, and the Aswat scores increased a lot, indicating that we've had a structural decline in the aggregate stability, which is allowing those cracks to form at the surface. And so I also compared in my experiment to a reference state soil, so a similar uneroded soil at each of the sites that I sampled. I found something which was similar to what a soil would have been like prior to this erosion, so that I could see how complete the recovery of carbon was at these sites. And so I had 2 study regions. I'll only be talking about Hay at the moment, but I also collected some samples around Brewarrina. When I was out sampling at each of the sites that I visited, I collected 7 samples from my 3 treatments. So a scalded soil, water ponded soil, and a reference state soil. And this is me being kindly pulled out of a bog, which I got myself in very nicely by a Hay landholder who unfortunately isn't here today. But thank you, Ian. I think he rescued me more than once from his property. So. And soil samples were collected to a depth of 100 centimetres with a hydraulic soil corer, and they were divided into 7 depth intervals and analysed. But I'll only be talking about the top 30 centimetres, which is the most relevant for carbon accounting. I used stratified random sampling for these sites. Fortunately, water ponds and schools are very easy to see from satellite imagery, so it made creating a sampling design very easy. Finding reference state soils is a fair bit more difficult, trying to figure out what soils within the landscape haven't been eroded and are similar to what they were before was quite a challenge, and I was reliant on New South Wales soil conservation records at their sites, as well as local landholder knowledge to find those less eroded areas within the landscape to provide references. And so soil carbon recovery in water ponds, we found a very positive response. So carbon increased significantly within our water ponded sites compared to the scalded areas, which is no surprise because we have an area which has no primary productivity to an area which we're starting to have photosynthesis occurring and carbon sequestration happening. And if you look at these lines here, so red is our reference soil, green is our water pond, and yellow is our scald. We can see that the water ponds are either performing similarly to our reference soils in terms of carbon accumulation, or in many cases actually outperformed the reference soils as well. And so we actually saw more carbon in those water ponded areas than we did in some of those reference soils. And this is just a quick box and whisker plot of the results. And so you can see there's a bit of variation between the sites, which was mostly linked to the amount of sodicity, so the amount of sodium bonded to the clays at each of these sites. And so One Tree was by far the most sodic of the 3 sites that I sampled, and we can see that all 3 of our treatment groups have the lowest carbon in that area. But looking at those box and whisker plots, we can see that we have significantly more carbon accumulating in water ponded sites, and in many cases is very similar or exceeding what we see within our reference state soils. And we can see that we've got very low carbon concentrations within the scalds, so below half a percent of soil mass in the top 30 centimetres is carbon, and we're starting to see carbon accumulating to somewhere around 0.5% and 0.6% within our water ponds, which for this area isn't too bad given that these are fairly degraded soils. And so across the Hay Plains region, I found that the reference state soils had about 0.4% carbon, scalded soils had about 0.3% carbon in the upper 30 centimetres by mass, and our water ponded soil was getting to about 0.5%. And so when we think about the carbon sequestration opportunity here, so in terms of the carbon stocks that we're managing, so per hectare in a scalded soil, on average, we had 13.6 tonnes of carbon per hectare in the upper 30 centimetres, and once we water ponded those scalds, that was increasing to about 20.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare, which is quite a significant amount of carbon sequestration for such a dry area, and that's about 7 tonnes per hectare, which could be a potentially financially viable carbon credit project. And so we have a really good carbon response in this experiment here because we've got a soil which is essentially non-functional. We don't have water infiltration, it's not supporting plant growth, and so we have an extremely low carbon concentration, basically as low as you can get in soils. And then we've changed that soil, revegetated it, got it to be part of a functional ecosystem again, and we've reinstituted a system where we have primary productivity occurring, we've got pasture back, and that means we've got quite significant carbon sequestration because we've made a very large change in a fairly small area. And that means it's also quite detectable. And so the next experiment I'm going to talk about, I faced some different issues and it was quite difficult to detect changes in carbon. And so small area, but big change is quite straightforward to detect. Small changes over bigger areas is a bit more of a challenge. And so the next experiment I'm going to talk to you guys today about is livestock exclusion. And so I looked at livestock exclusion at 3 sites on a property northwest of Hay, which is part of a sandhill restoration project. So 3 sandhill sites were fenced off in, 2 sandhill sites were fenced off in 2017 and 1 was fenced off in 2020. And these were fenced to protect some remnant vegetation, which is sensitive to grazing pressure. And so it was protecting stands of cypress pine, rosewood and needlewood, and also maintaining ground cover on sandhills, which are quite prone to wind erosion within the landscape. And so these 3 sites had really good ground cover compared to the adjacent areas. You guys can see this satellite map here. So the big fenced area are 2 of the sites, divided by a fence between them. And if you guys compare to the sandhill north and south of there, you can see that even just visually on a satellite image, we can see that there's quite a lot more ground cover within that area, which is a good indicator that we're having carbon accumulating, right? Because ground cover is a driver of soil organic carbon accumulation. There's also been substantial saltbush regeneration within those grazing excluded areas, which are also a driver of carbon sequestration in these landscapes, because we have more woody vegetation, more complex cover on the landscape. And so these are strong improvements in drivers of soil organic carbon. And so I saw this and I thought, brilliant, it's going to be a nice straightforward experiment, collect some cores inside, some cores outside, we'll have a nice carbon response and it'll be a nice easy paper. I was unfortunately wrong, and it was a bit more difficult than that. And here's just some indications of the ground cover that I saw in the site. So on your left, we've got the ground cover outside the grazing exclusion area, and then we've got ground cover inside the grazing exclusion area. So we can see we've got a lot more saltbush, we've got a bit more tall cover, whereas outside the grazing exclusion area, in the normal pasture, we've just got a fairly low cover of our annual plants that we're putting their head up. And so, yep, like I was saying, I sampled, I created a random stratified sampling design again. So 20 cores collected from each of the 3 sites inside and outside the grazing exclusion area on top of the sandhill. And then I took those samples back, looked at the upper 30 centimetres divided between 3 depth intervals and analysed them for carbon. And this is the average soil carbon in the upper 30 centimetres as a percentage. And as you guys can see, across the 3 sites, I had no significant difference between these treatments. And so even though I collected quite a lot of samples, that's 120 samples, I was unable to detect a difference between carbon concentrations inside and outside this grazing area. And they were quite similar. And actually, if we look at the averages, they're literally almost exactly the same. And so it's only by rounding that these are 0.01% different. I think they're 0.07% different, those averages. And so it's not only not statistically significantly different, it actually isn't different. And so it's completely the same. And so quite challenging to detect what looked like surely would have been a carbon difference between those sites. If you stand at the fence, one side we've got salt bush up to your waist, grass up to your knees. On the other side, we've got a fairly close crop pasture, still in good condition, but much less biomass outside the fenced area. And even still, it's very difficult to detect that change. And there's been a lot of talk about using grazing management as a means for sequestering carbon, particularly in the rangelands, because if we make a change to grazing management in a paddock that's a couple of 100 hectares, even if we have a 0.2 or 0.3% change in the amount of carbon across such a large area, it could be a huge amount of carbon sequestration, but it won't count towards anything if you can't actually experimentally find the difference. So, and that may take a lot of samples. And so I've got a few reasons why these results ended up being so similar between these 2 treatments. So grazing pressure, for a starter, isn't fully controlled between these sites. The grazing exclusion areas don't have livestock on them, but they still have feral and native herbivores going onto them. And I'm sure any landholders in the area are very familiar with the fact that as soon as you spell a paddock, all of the kangaroos just go into that one and eat that out. So it's not like we've completely excluded grazing pressure from this area, and we don't actually have very good control over it necessarily either. But we have removed some of the grazing pressure from the site, but difficult to figure out exactly how much. Also, these sites have very sandy soil texture. These, in many places, are classified as an arenosol, which is a sand over 1 metre deep. And so sandy soils don't accumulate carbon nearly as well as their clay counterparts, because sand minerals don't stabilise organic matter in the same way that clay soils do. And so if this experiment was run on a clay soil site, we may be seeing a bigger difference in carbon, but certainly on these sandy soils, it's very difficult to detect that change. And then also, just inevitably, because we're in rangelands, small changes in soil carbon are very difficult to detect. And that's because the distribution of carbon, even at small scales, is extremely variable. And so I didn't put a slide up, and I should have actually, but I found that proximity to a salt bush was a high predictor of soil carbon. And so if you take a sample directly underneath the canopy of a salt bush, you have much higher carbon compared to the interspace 30 centimetres away. And that effect falls off at about 10 centimetres out from the saltbush. And so because we have such variable distribution of vegetation within the landscape, because you've got a saltbush over here, you've got one over there, a bit of sparse grass between it, that's all strongly influencing the distribution of carbon. And because we have so much variability at fine scales compared to, say, pasture further east, which has a much more uniform distribution of carbon, it's very difficult to detect changes because there's so much noise within the data set that you end up collecting, and it makes it very difficult to find the signal of carbon change without taking heaps of samples. And so it's worth thinking about that, even though we might be having very large changes of soil carbon within the landscape, as a result of different management practices, it may be very difficult to detect those changes. And that's not to say that these practices aren't worth doing. So changing to a different grazing management strategy that might be easier on the land is definitely an activity worth pursuing by itself, but it might be very difficult to be able to claim a carbon credit on that kind of activity. So it's just something that's worth thinking about. And then also, why are these results so similar as well? It's also worth considering the fact that most of soil carbon is controlled by variables that are completely out of our control in the rangeland environment. And so this is a graph from a study that looked at tons of sites across eastern Australia, and they were trying to figure out what the dominant controls of soil carbon were within farmed landscapes. And basically they found that more than half of the variability in soil carbon, up the top there, is controlled by aridity, so how much rainfall we're getting, as well as how much evapotranspiration is. And then another 14% of that variability is controlled by the concentration of clay within the soils. And so both of those features are completely out of our control. And then another one which I'll draw your attention to is land uses, and that's the management decisions we're making, and this is comparing between cropping and pastures, and so they've got very different land uses here, and they found that that's contributing to 0.14% of the R-squared, so about 1.4% of the variation in soil carbon within the landscape that they were detecting. And so it's worth just keeping in mind that if somebody's coming to you with a carbon project, or you're making some management changes and you're thinking about whether or not it's worth trying to create a carbon project out of it, it's worth considering how much carbon you're anticipating sequestering and whether or not you think that will actually be a detectable amount. Because if you can't detect it, you won't be able to claim it, and so you might be running a carbon project, out of your own cost potentially, that might end up not paying off. So these are all things worth considering. And that's all I've got for you guys today. So, I'm missing a slide here, sorry. I'd like to thank the Department of Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water for funding my project that was looking at the Scald reclamation. And again, I'd like to thank Sally Ware and the Hay Local Land Services for all the help they've given me during the process of my PhD. Any questions? Yep.
We've got one down here. Yep. The mics are coming around.
G'day, I'm a farmer in the local area. I was just wondering if there's any interest in figuring out how much carbon, because all farming could arguably be carbon farming, where it's being taken up by the plants, it then goes into the animals that we feed, which goes into either meat or wool products.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly storing carbon out of the atmosphere. A product like meat probably isn't a very permanent storage of carbon, because that will be eaten and then metabolized by whoever eats it, turning that back into CO2. But something like wool, I suppose, as a product, will store that carbon longer term, as long as the garment or whatever is made out of that wool is still being used. I mean, there's similar discussions being had about forestry, for example, where wood products that are going into a house for 100 years, that carbon is being stored in that wood. But I think in a production system, I suspect that the wool and meat being produced, particularly in a rangeland environment where we have relatively low stocking rates, probably won't represent a huge amount of carbon. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's an interesting idea though, for sure.
Hi, I'm Yuki from the University of Sydney. I was wondering, like, what would the implementation of like water ponds look like, for farmers, of like the feasibility of it?
So it's a very popular strategy. I mean, if you look at any Google imagery from around the Mara region, which is just west of the Macquarie Marshes, there's literally, even here, I mean, around the Hay Plains region, if you hop on a satellite map and you just look around, you'll find water ponds all over the place. And so it's actually a method that's already being used and applied really extensively across the landscape because it's so effective at reclaiming those scalded areas. And importantly, it's an activity worth doing by itself. So we're not just doing water ponding for carbon sequestration. People are, landholders are doing water ponding to reclaim pasture, which has a production benefit, and a big enough production benefit that it's worthwhile doing as an activity already, or else they wouldn't have been. It's just that we can also potentially work with the co-benefit of being able to sequester carbon and fairly easily measure that change in carbon as well. And so, in the environment we're in now, where we have like MLA signing up to a target for carbon neutrality by 2030, for example, we all need to start thinking about carbon. Maybe we don't need to be making big management decisions necessarily exclusively based on carbon, but if we're already doing management activities that could potentially sequester carbon and help us offset our own carbon emissions, or potentially make some money off selling those to somebody else who needs to offset theirs, it may be worth doing that for management decisions that we're already making, which have robust carbon sequestration opportunities. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Isabel from the University of Sydney. Hi. Just two questions. First of all, would you be able to run us through the timeline of the water ponding, like how long it takes and if it undoes itself?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is actually one of the beauties of water ponding, is that it's quite a permanent solution, because once we flush those salts from the surface of the soil, because we're in a dry land environment and we don't have much groundwater seepage here, those salts tend to stay down in the soil profile, and once those changes have occurred, it's pretty much done. And so we actually have a very permanent solution, which is very good for carbon sequestration. We don't want in 25 years the carbon that we've sequestered going back into the atmosphere, because that defeats the point. But the chemical changes that occur in water ponds, it's very dependent on rainfall, but after a good year of rain, you can have those salts flushed to 50 centimetres after one good year of rain. And so some of the sites at Brewarrina, I took some cores in ponds that had been put in 9 months earlier, and the new wetting front was already down at 40 centimetres, and the sodium salts were already washed down to that point. And so the carbon recovery takes longer. So I sampled a few that were 5 years old, that had been put in 5 years earlier, and they had accumulated quite a substantial amount of carbon. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think they were something like 60% of the way there compared to similar ones that were 10 years old. And so at 10 years, we start seeing the plateau, and those samples at One Tree, I won't go back, at One Tree, those water ponds were put in 1963, and the carbon that they're stored at that time is still there within the landscape. And so we've got a pretty good permanence message there. That's over 60 years that carbon is still stored within the landscape. So yeah, good permanence and a pretty quick turnaround for sequestering that carbon as well. Yeah.
And then just, sorry, a second follow-up. Did you do any measuring of the nitrogen or anything like that? Was there any fertilizer using nitrogen throughout these areas that you sampled?
Yep.
Because I know that can affect carbon.
Yeah. So I measured nitrogen. There's no fertilisation going on. It's too expensive for the remediation in this area, just because of the amount of production you can expect off the landscape. The nitrogen store is very similar to carbon, so often the scalded soils have increased levels of nitrogen as well as phosphorus compared to the water ponds, and that's because those minerals are just in their mineral form within those soils because there's no plants exploiting them. And then once we have a water pond established, we then get similar carbon-nitrogen ratios and similar levels of phosphorus to what we're seeing in the reference state soils. And that's just because those nutrients and minerals are being uptaken by plants and actually being used. Yeah. Cool. Oh, yep.
On the Rural Financial Counsellor for the district, And I'm just wanting to know, I've always got farmers looking for different ways to diversify, and what's the, once you've detected the viable change, what's the size of the area that someone needs to be viable in this area?
So, I mean, it's all a question of how big the area you're managing is, I suppose. It's tricky. So it's based on how much you're getting for your carbon credits. Are you getting $300 for a tonne of carbon, for example? And I suppose it's all kind of dependent on how much of an area you're managing anyway. I would hesitate to recommend doing management decisions specifically for carbon sequestration, but rather, at least at this point, but rather if you're doing these activities anyway and you can collect a co-benefit of carbon sequestration, it may be worth doing. And so obviously the bigger the area we're managing, the more carbon we're going to be sequestering. But yeah, the financial decisions are tricky. I think it's dependent on how much it costs you to set up the carbon project. And so potentially managing a very small area for carbon sequestration gains, like 4 hectares, for example. If you're water ponding 4 hectares of soil, you get 7 tonnes a hectare. So you're ending up with 28 tonnes of carbon. If that's $300 a tonne, you could be selling it for. I'm not going to be able to do that maths quickly enough in my head, but if you needed to have somebody like a consultant help you out establishing that project, you may end up coming out with not a lot of finance at the end of that. And so I suspect that we're going to have a bit of an economies of scale problem where we need to be doing relatively large, like say 8-10 hectares of remediation to be able to claim like a viable carbon sequestration project. But I don't know much about the finances, I'm afraid, yeah.
I'm just curious because I get asked the question.
Yeah.
And does everybody need to have a consultant, or is that something through the LLS you can access? Or?
I'm really not sure, sorry. Yeah, I'm not too clued into the whole carbon market thing necessarily, yeah, sorry.
Okay, no, I'll
Yeah.
stop on that.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, guys.
I've got one quick question before we stop. You can't go away too quickly. The Lugston family are down the back. As that was the Sandhill exclusion zone is one of the Sandhill reclamation areas that we completed under a project a few years ago, back in 2018. 2018, yep. Maybe over a period of time, we'll start to see a change in that organic carbon, like, you know, a long period of time. You know, you're not seeing the results now, and we've had a lot of dry as well as the La Nina, but maybe in a few more years' time, you'd start to see that difference.
Yep. Yeah, that's also a potential reason why we're not seeing that change is because carbon accumulation can take a long time, but often it also is quite a quick response too. But I think the limiting factor for that site, particularly from a carbon perspective, would be the sandy soil type. It's just very prohibitive to significant amount of carbon accumulation. Whereas in a clay soil site, I would be more positive about the potential for accumulation over a long period, just because you have those clay minerals stabilising soil organic matter. Yeah.
Well done. Fantastic.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Great job. Excellent.